The Zelda team accomplished the impossible by successfully translating The Legend of Zelda into the third dimension with Ocarina of Time. Rather than rest on their laurels, they immediately tackled perhaps an even more Herculean challenge. How do you follow up on one of the most acclaimed games of all time? The project began its life as a simple remix of the Ocarina dungeons, later released as Master Quest, but before long it became clear that the team would have to go big or go home. In what might be the most astounding development cycle in history, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was released less than a year and a half after Ocarina of Time. In order to accomplish this, the designers were forced to think outside the box, crafting a totally unique story and world that is actually elevated by its limitations. Majora's Mask is every bit the timeless masterpiece Ocarina of Time was, and perhaps even surpasses its predecessor with an experimental approach that sets it apart as a truly one-of-a-kind experience. We open on a travel-weary Link, his quest completed, in search of his companion, Navi. At once, Majora's Mask is definitively established to be a direct sequel to the events of Ocarina of Time. It's a continuation of that Link's story. I find this to be a really interesting place to find Link. You would think the hero of time would be out celebrating his victory with Zelda in Castletown, but instead he wanders the Lost Woods all alone. I never got the impression that Navi and Link were especially close in Ocarina, but it does make sense with how much they experienced together. Navi was the only one who understands all that he went through across both timelines. By establishing Link's emotional emptiness in her absence, Navi's character in Ocarina is retroactively elevated for me. Link fails to find Navi, but does run into two other fairies, the mischievous Tattle and Tail, alongside their leader Skull Kid. The three accost Link and run off with his ocarina and Epona. Most video game sequels have to somehow reset the character's inventory. This incident accomplishes that effectively enough. A desperate Link gives chase and shows off his gains while he's at it. My man's got some sick moves. Or maybe not. Anyway, Link gracefully follows Skull Kid through the rabbit hole into an unfamiliar, strange new world, Termina. Things go from bad to worse when Skull Kid places a curse on Link, transforming him into a lowly Deku scrub. A terrible fate for our hero, but fun and games to Skull Kid and the terrifying power his mask possesses. I've always loved the trickster archetype for an antagonist, and it's essential that this game's villain be as different from Ganondorf as possible. This new form Link finds himself in is far more limited than his acrobatic human form, but does have its own unique skills, chief among them the ability to launch out of Deku flowers, and glide through the air over great distances. We're forced to place our trust and hope with a seemingly sinister stranger who introduces himself as the Happy Mask Salesman. The salesman's facial expression is so unnerving to me, and the way the game jump cuts between his animations with no transition frames really seals the deal. This is one seriously creepy guy. Awesome character design. His proposal? Retrieve the magical mask Skull Kid stole before 3 days pass, and he can return Link to normal. Our first steps into Clock Town reveal the heart of the game. I absolutely love spending time here. There's so much energy as everyone goes about their own life, and the theme song is a stone-cold classic. When you compare Clock Town to Ocarina's Castle Town, it's crazy how far we've progressed, all while using the same engine and running on the same console, albeit with the addition of the memory expansion pack. Not everything is available right away, but this town is overflowing with interesting things to see and do. The expansive town is divided into 4 main sections, which are each packed with secrets, minigames, shops, and interesting characters. Like this weirdo, who will hereby never be mentioned again for the duration of this video. At this point you are locked into Clock Town until certain tasks are completed. Think of these first 3 days as the tutorial. There's so much to check out here, but our immediate task is to locate the stray fairy in town, to restore the Great Fairy to her former glory. This unlocks Deku Link's ability to shoot magic bubbles, a pathetic replacement for the slingshot. Coupled with an awkward spin move and dropping Deku Nuts, this form really has paltry offensive capabilities. It's baffling, but your bubbles somehow manage to impress the bombers, a gang of children who terrorize Clocktown with their shenanigans. They challenge Link to a game of hide and seek, as all legit gangs do. This hunt for the bombers forces you to explore Clocktown thoroughly, as they are actually pretty good hiders. After being subjected to some casual racism, Deku Link is allowed into the bomber's secret hideout, and we're introduced to yet another unique ability of the Deku form, skipping over water. The way momentum works allows you to gain a surprising amount of speed, and offers the ability much more depth and fun than you would expect. There isn't much to do in the observatory, other than enjoy some more amazing music, but a peek into the telescope reveals two things: where Skull Kid is hanging out, and the fact that we can no longer ignore the massive moon casting a growing shadow over Termina. The opening to the clock tower doesn't open until the eve of the carnival, so we'll have to wait a bit before reuniting with the Skull Kid. It is possible to skip ahead with the Song of Double Time, or bypass the guards with some exploits, but this isn't something a new player would know. The game makes you wait out until the last day. Between the 2 scavenger hunts and spending a full 3-day cycle within the walls of Clocktown, it's nearly impossible for a player to complete the tutorial without gaining an intimate familiarity with all of its minute facets. No other Zelda game ties itself so closely to a single location, so this is great design in my book. Every cycle begins in Clocktown, and the vast majority of NPCs spend their last days within its walls. These people and this place are what we are endeavoring to save, so it's important that the player forms a bond with them as soon as possible. With our patience well and truly proven, we are finally able to confront Skull Kid. The threat to Termina is fully revealed. Skull Kid is bringing the moon down to destroy the world. The why remains to be seen, but Tail alludes to entities in the 4 corners of Termina who could help. I respect the intelligence behind training the player to shoot down a Majora's Mask balloon earlier, and now presenting them with the real thing. Little touches like this that you barely even notice can make a really big difference. I love Zelda's brief appearance here when Link recalls her teaching the Song of Time. It's another way Majora's Mask ties itself back to Ocarina, and of course I could never turn down listening to Zelda's lullaby. The Song of Time sounded a bit better on the Ocarina than on the Deku pipes, but they do the job. Link is transported 3 days into the past. Of course, Link is no stranger to time travel, but the way it is treated in Majora's Mask is fundamentally different to how it was implemented in Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, Link jumps between 2 time periods, 7 years apart, and the actions he takes as a child directly impact the world he explores as an adult. Majora's Mask treats time travel as a total reset. When you play the Song of Time, everything returns to its state from the beginning of the 3-day cycle. It's like none of your actions ever happened. I'm not here to poke holes in either version, and I couldn't tell you which is more scientifically accurate, but I can confidently say Majora's Mask makes masterful use of its version of time travel. The 3-day cycle was clearly born out of necessity. There was just no way the development team could match the scale of Ocarina's world in Majora's rushed development cycle. I've got to assume that the idea for an in-game disaster, constantly ticking closer and closer, was itself inspired by the team's stress over their own looming deadline. A cynical view of the mechanic would focus on the ways that constantly resetting the player's progress masks the comparable lack of content and pads out the game length. I can't deny that there is a little bit of truth to this outlook. Majora's Mask is inarguably small in scope compared to Ocarina, and I too have felt the frustration of being forced to restart a dungeon from the beginning after running out of time. But focusing on these points is a complete disservice to all of the incredibly creative ways the game takes advantage of its 3-day cycle to create a deeper experience filled with unique scenarios that could only happen in Majora's Mask. Absolutely everything in the game runs on a set schedule that never changes. Just as the moon will crash into Clocktown at exactly 72 hours, Sekon will rob an old lady at midnight on the first night in North Clocktown. The mailman will always begin his day collecting letters at 9 AM, take a nap at noon, and then set out delivering the letters at 1 PM. No matter what Link accomplishes in a cycle, or how many times he relives these 3 days, everything resets and plays out in the exact same way when the Song of Time is played. This limitation of a rigidly set loop ironically leads to far more complex and realistic NPC behavior than if they were allowed to roam on their own accord unpredictably. It's not at all taxing on the hardware to simply say that this person is at this location at this time, no matter what. So the devs could actually put much more thought into using their preset behaviors to create a lively world and engaging side stories. Because everything always plays out predictably, it's easy for this game to take on a cozy vibe. Surely I'm not the only player to gain immense satisfaction in gradually learning everyone's schedules. Sometimes I'll literally spend a whole cycle following a single character around just to see what their life looks like. The Bomber's Notebook does a serviceable job of tracking schedules for you, but it isn't enough to entirely rely on. Besides, nothing replaces the fulfillment of actually learning and understanding all of the events of the 3-day cycle for yourself. The Happy Mask Salesman somehow takes on an even more sinister air when Link returns having failed to retrieve Majora's Mask. Once you realize that he is the only entity that remembers events from prior cycles, it does raise many questions on just who this omniscient quest giver is. I like to think of him like the Dungeon Master in a D&D game. He provides context and stakes to the adventure, but largely remains a passive entity and exists almost outside reality. The exception to that rule is when he steps in to teach Link the Song of Healing, which restores him to his true form. The spirit of the Deku remains within a mask that Link can use to swap back and forth at will. It's obviously an unpleasant process, as each transformation is accompanied by an intense scream of pain that masterfully heightens the shroud of darkness enveloping the entire game. With our shackles now removed, we are free to explore Termina to our heart's content. The first steps outside Clocktown are so exciting because this is the point the player fully comprehends that Termina is a completely new world to discover. Termina Field, like Hyrule Field, is somewhat barren, but there are a number of secrets scattered about, and the various distinct biomes within add to its appeal. It largely functions as a hub between the 4 main zones of the game, with Clocktown exactly in the center and an exit exactly in each of the 4 cardinal directions. Termina Field does suffer a bit in terms of immersion for me. Hyrule Field's layout was much more natural feeling. This feels too utilitarian. The Zelda main theme also just sounds out of place while roaming the most un-Zelda location yet. It makes me curious why the main theme was completely absent from Ocarina of Time. Before we leave Termina Field, I do want to draw attention to this brief moment where you run into a wood carving made by the Skull Kid long ago. This prompts Tattle to recount her fond memories of Skull Kid before he stole the mask. Even this early, the game is leading the player to pity the villain. Skull Kid led a lonely life until the Twin Fairies befriended him, and just when his life began to turn around, the mask's powers overtook him. Deep down, Skull Kid isn't really a bad guy. It's the mask that is controlling him and elevating all of his negative emotions. Tattle is already proving a massive improvement over Navi. Because the two look so similar, it's easy to think they function the same in their respective games, but that is far from the truth. Tattle brings so much more personality. She is at first reluctant to be stuck with Link, having been left behind by Skull Kid, but she does gradually grow closer and closer to him. She is frequently informal and even playfully rude with Link, which gives her much more depth as a character than the often robotic Navi. Her history with Skull Kid is also invaluable in deepening his character and backstory, as seen in this brief memory. You can attempt to explore in any of the 4 directions, but ultimately the dungeon order is prescribed for you. We're going to start by heading south to the southern swamp. It's quite a shock when you run into Ganondorf's surrogate mothers, the Twin Rova duo of witches, running a mom-and-pop potion shop. In order to speed up development, Majora's Mask opts to recycle and repurpose the character models from Ocarina of Time. Obviously, this is smart from a practical point of view, but it's also another way that Majora's Mask uses its limitations to its advantage. It's genuinely off-putting interacting with these mirror versions of characters you are already acquainted with. These kindly old hags are so sweet in Majora's Mask. It's hard to believe they could be Ganondorf's most loyal servants in another world. From its accelerated tutorial and more demanding challenges in the early game, It's obvious there is an assumption that the player has already beaten Ocarina of Time, which the devs take advantage of with fun surprises like Kutake and Kume. The latter was injured in this game's version of the Lost Woods, so with the help of a friendly pack of monkeys, Link hand delivers a potion. In thanks, he is given a free cruise ride to the Deku Kingdom. Progress had been blocked by a comically large Octo, but he doesn't stand a chance against our cruise ship. Ouch, that's gotta hurt. The Deku are very hostile to outsiders, but our handy Deku mask enables us to waltz right into their throne room, to find quite a commotion. The Deku King is in a panic over the disappearance of his daughter. Gotta wonder what kind of adhesive he's using on that modesty leaf. Strong stuff. The king is accusing one of our monkey friends of kidnapping his daughter. Obviously he's innocent, I mean look at that face. So it's up to Link to set the story straight and save the little guy from death row. As much as I love the monkeys, I can't get upset at the Deku either. They're so darn likable to me. Between their frantic animations and quirky sound effects, I just find them so adorable. I really like how varied their designs are too. The simple scrubs have a totally different look from the king or the butler, but still fit together wonderfully. The Deku Butler is actually one of my favorite Zelda characters for some inexplicable reason. It's later hinted that Skull Kid actually used the soul of the butler's son for his curse on Link. It goes without saying that Majora's Mask is more mature than your typical Zelda game, but that is still astonishingly dark. I love how the butler remains professional and level-headed in his role, despite the tragedy that he's faced. It's worth mentioning that this game is the first to really elevate the Deku from an enemy type to a full-blown race alongside the likes of the Goron and the Zora. And what a great decision that was. These guys are a wonderful addition. Skillful use of Deku Link's unique moveset reveals a secret entrance to the throne room, where you can get the 411 directly from the incarcerated. He lays any doubts to rest and bids us to hurry to the Woodfall Temple to rescue the princess, showing genuine care for her safety and not just clearing his name. As if we needed even more motivation than that leaf hanging on for dear life. From here, it's just a matter of lily pad skipping and flower gliding to the temple. The Deku mask is really well utilized here. Previously, the Deku form felt awkward, but it achieves a certain level of grace on its home turf. Deku Link is thriving in the Deku Kingdom, and it's human Link that has a difficult time maneuvering. Before you begin, it's a good idea to start a new cycle. Now that we know how to get to the temple and the song required to gain entry, we'll be able to skip almost all of the prerequisites upon resetting, and use our entire time limit on just the dungeon. Majora's Mask touts a much improved fast travel system, courtesy of her old friend Kapora Gabora. Only one song this time, the Song of Soaring, instead of the complicated location-specific ones, and it uses much more convenient access points. Gotta love quality of life improvements. One warp point can take us right to the dungeon entrance, so let's jump in. Woodfall Temple isn't an especially challenging dungeon, but when you compare it to the introductory Great Deku Tree in Ocarina, it is surprisingly complex. That being said, it definitely lags behind its counterpart in both personality and memorable moments. Just like the swamp surrounding it, Woodfall Temple makes heavy use of the Deku mask and the unique abilities that come with it. Cavernous drops, poisonous water, and carnivorous lily pads necessitate swapping off Link's traditional hero form. Most of the dungeon's big puzzles revolve around spreading fire, with Deku sticks or with the dungeon item, the bow. I don't have a lot of praise for the dungeon, it is by far the most forgettable in the game, but that doesn't mean it's outright bad, and I will commend its use of verticality, with many large multi-tiered rooms. Majora's Mask adds a new twist to the formula with each of its dungeons, the addition of 15 stray fairies hidden within. I really enjoy the added difficulty of this scavenger hunt side quest. It's a genuine challenge that requires meticulously combing each room, as these fairies can be hidden literally anywhere. The prizes aren't essential, but are a nice bonus for your hard work. In this case, a magical sword spin attack that will really come in handy in the future. The boss of Woodfall Temple, Odolwa, is a mediocre boss befitting a mediocre dungeon. I don't find his design memorable at all, just a big goofy swordsman with a really annoying voice. There isn't any interesting lore or deeper connection to the temple or Woodfall area. He's just a big evil tribal guy who somehow poisoned the swamp. The one thing he has going for him is the variety of ways you can tackle the fight, with your bow, the bombs scattered around the area, or Deku Link's spin move in the Deku Flower in the center. Just watch out for the fire spell, which will spell doom for the Deku form. His moveset is a bit more varied than it appears at first. For example, he can summon various bugs that join in the assault on Link. I really like how the moths are attracted to bombs. It's a nice touch. The mini-boss of the temple, Gecko in his Snapper steed, is way cooler to me. This pair is just hilarious looking, and the fight has a lot going on and keeps you on your toes. Both the Deku mask and the bow are well integrated into the fight. Launch out of a flower to flip the Snapper, and then shoot Gecko off the ceiling. Defeating Odolwa frees the peaceful spirit of a giant that was trapped within. This one teaches you the Oath to Order, but otherwise is kept mysterious for now. Obviously, we'll be discussing these giants in more detail later on. Clearing the dungeon also allows us to rescue the Deku Princess and clear our simian buddy's name. Recalling the unfortunate incident with an especially clingy Princess Rudo, and endeavoring to avoid a life as the Deku Prince, Link bottles up the Deku Damsel, thus avoiding any unnecessary physical contact, and preserving his priceless bachelor status. Perhaps it was Link who deserved the Triforce of Wisdom after all. That is some serious character development. Upon exiting the temple, it's revealed that the southern swamp has been cleansed and the entire area has been transformed. After each dungeon is cleared, it's a good idea to explore the area once again, to discover what's changed. In this case, we can earn some goodies at Kume's Boatyard target tests, a really fun minigame, and make our way through the maze-like Deku Shrine with the Butler, a challenge very similar to Dampé's ghostly race in Ocarina of Time. Completing the area's dungeon, locating all of the stray fairies, and then exploring the newly restored realm is a lot to ask, and this is where the game's time limit really becomes a challenge. Even if you reset just prior to starting the dungeon, you only have about 54 real-world minutes at normal clock speed, which turns the dungeon into a frantic race against the clock. This is a rewarding challenge for experienced players, but most will be better off playing the inverted Song of Time to triple that timer up to approximately 2 hours and 42 minutes of real-world time. Even with all that extra breathing room, the player will always be keeping an eye on the clock, a constant reminder to keep moving. It might not happen with this first dungeon, but most players will eventually find themselves face to face with the moon's collision at the end of the third day, before they've checked everything off of their to-do list. Understanding that replaying the same content is rarely fun, the game offers many ways to trim down on wasted time. The Song of Soaring can usually be used to drop Link right at the entrance of the dungeon. The dungeons are also often designed in a way that the dungeon item offers shortcuts through the normal progression, where many of the early rooms can be completely bypassed if the item has already been acquired. If you manage to beat the dungeon boss and just want some more time to explore after the area is restored, the key items of the monster's remains allow you to skip right to the boss room for a rematch. Outside of the massive time savings this offers, it also allows you to revisit the boss fights as often as you like without starting a new save file, something that should not be taken for granted. Even if you don't use any of these time-saving inclusions, maybe you ran out of time before even getting to the dungeon, you'd be surprised how quickly you can make your way through the game if you already know what needs to be done and how to do it efficiently. The player's knowledge and experience truly is the greatest tool at their disposal. The criticisms of Majora's Mask's time loop system as a cheap way to pad out game length by forcing filler repeat content don't hold much ground to me once all these time-saving considerations are taken into consideration. To an even greater extent than in Ocarina of Time, there's a very obvious chapter or act structure to the main progression in the game, which some might appreciate while others might find too gamey or immersion breaking. Regardless of how you feel, it's time to say goodbye to the Deku and head north to the mountainous Snowhead region. Entry to Snowhead was previously off limits, but the bow handily shatters the icicle barrier. I think this is a little aggressive of an item gate. The game could have let us get halfway up the mountain before halting progress. Denying all entry to even the base of the mountain just feels needlessly restrictive on our adventure. We haven't seen many snowy areas in the prior Zelda games, and Snowhead is way more expansive than something like Ocarina's Ice Cavern. But the Goron's plight being so similar to the Zora's in Ocarina of Time's future timeline is a little tiresome. Just like their aquatic counterparts, the Goron are simply not built for the cold. They look so pathetic as they stand around shivering helplessly. Instant empathy achieved through simple yet stellar animation work. It really shouldn't be surprising by this point, but our Owl Guardian is here to help. He'll guide Link across a perilous series of invisible platforms leading to a secret shrine. Within lies the Lens of Truth, which functions identically from Ocarina of Time, revealing hidden paths and secrets like the platforms we just crossed, or the Goron ghost waiting for us on the other side. Darmani, a fallen Goron hero devoted to his tribe even in death, guides Link to his gravestone where he begs to be freed from his anguish. A soothing ocarina melody finally grants him a peaceful rest. The depiction of his memories is truly emotional, and fills me with determination to continue the fight in his stead. His power is encapsulated in a mask similar to the Deku mask, although this form carries a bit more dignity. Seeing the Goron mistake Link for their beloved warrior is simultaneously sad and uplifting. The game does a magnificent job of adding character to the masks. You don't just inhabit a generic Goron, you continue the legacy of Darmani, the legendary warrior, beloved by his tribe. The mask's transformation comes equipped with sturdy, if sluggish, fighting capabilities, but the real star is the incredible rolling ability. When the Goron's signature method of movement was created in Ocarina of Time, I don't expect that developers ever considered this power in the hand of the player, but it works so well you'd swear that that was always the intent. The brief rev-up period, suddenly exploding into a blast of nearly uncontrollable speed, is endlessly thrilling, and fills me with wonder that it was actually able to be incorporated into the game. I could easily have forgiven the devs if the rolling implementation was deemed unfeasible, and the Goron powers were limited to more reasonable actions like simple punches or slams, but they somehow managed it, and it's pretty much perfect. The difficulty in controlling the speed around corners or obstacles is inherent to the appeal, so I would never dock it for something like that. A high skill ceiling should be encouraged. A Goron brother loyally watching over Darmani's grave theorizes that the hot spring water underground may have been what revived the hero. This spring water can be recovered by pushing the headstone aside with the tremendous strength of the Goron transformation, essentially a replacement for the gauntlets of Ocarina of Time. It's not a permanent solution, obviously, but a bottle of spring water does offer temporary reprieve for frozen Goron. This just highlights the need to tackle the actual problem of the eternal winter plaguing the land. More thorough exploration of Goron Village introduces another, possibly even more dire plight for the Goron. The Elder's infant son just won't shut up. Sounds like the Elder tried to head to Snowhead in Darmani's place, but if the great Darmani couldn't make it, what are the chances the feeble Elder did? Depending on the day, the frozen Elder can be found in multiple different spots. He's so thoroughly iced it can be a little tricky to spot him, but the road to Snowhead doesn't consist of that much space to search. The Elder is obviously shocked to see you back in the land of the living, and his concern for his son is so tender and sweet. He wants to teach Darmani the Goron lullaby to comfort his son, but unfortunately his memory is failing him and he only remembers the first half. Luckily for the village, that's enough for the baby to fill in the rest, and when you put the two halves together, you've acquired the extremely potent Goron lullaby. That's one Goron crisis averted. Now let's tackle the other one by finishing the journey the Elder Goron began, and making our way to Snowhead. The unforgiving storm here is actually a product of an invisible, cursed Big Goron. Thanks Tattle for the hint to use the Lens of Truth. The Goron lullaby comes in handy to put him to sleep, allowing us to cross over to the temple safely and avoid echoing Darmani's demise. I really like how the lullaby is put to use here. It feels much more organic than playing the Sonata of Awakening on Deku Link's pipes to open the Woodfall temple, even though it is ostensibly the same thing. Snowhead Temple is an excellent dungeon and far more satisfying than Woodfall was. The dungeon is arranged around a wide open, monstrously tall central room of 5 floors, and you are tasked with figuring out how to make your way to the tip top where the boss room is. There are a bunch of great puzzles and platforming challenges in the rooms dotting the perimeter of the central room that open up interesting routes throughout the tower. It's not just a linear floor 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5, but you are popping in and out of different floors and actually exploring the area as a 3D space. The tower layout offers tangible sense of progress and a clear direction for you to aim in. I always love it when you, as the player, actually get to impact the layout of the dungeons, and there's a bit of that here too. At some points, you can make your way to breakable blocks in the central pillar that can be smashed to drop the pillar lower and gain entry to new paths. Stuff like this is always so satisfying and is universally characteristic of an excellent dungeon design. I was initially disappointed to discover the dungeon item as merely the fire arrows, instead of a totally novel item. But when you consider all that the Goron transformation brings, this really isn't a concern at all. The entire dungeon revolves around not just the fire arrows, but the Goron Mask's consolidation of Ocarina's Megaton Hammer, Iron Boots, Gauntlets, and of course the wholly unique rolling mechanic. It's worth mentioning that navigating the dungeon requires not just the combination of both human and Goron Link, but even some isolated use of the Deku transformation. Outside of Woodfall, Deku Link goes woefully underutilized, so I've got to celebrate its utility here, especially in attaining some of the trickiest stray fairies. The Lens of Truth elevates the stray fairy challenge even further. The extra complexity this side objective adds to the game's dungeons is fantastic. The mini-boss of the dungeon is an irritating fight against a Wizrobe that is repeated twice. The teleporting and illusionary copies are cool for sure, but the ice magic the enemy uses has such a generous area of effect and is so annoying to get hit with, that I can't say I enjoy fighting these guys. It is admittedly cool to see the return of a classic Zelda enemy from the 2D games, reimagined for 3D though. Any concern about weak boss design in Majora's Mask is put to bed with the fight against Goat. Easily one of the most creative boss fights in the entire series, it makes perfect use of the Goron's signature move. Chasing this mechanical bull around the loop while dodging his attacks requires absolute mastery of control, and offers a wholly unique thrill to this fight. No other boss makes me appreciate the game's new option for replaying these climactic challenges like the face-off against Goat. I look forward to seeing the fruits of my labor every time I clear a dungeon in Majora's Mask. In Snowhead's case, the eternal winter finally gives way to spring, and the entire region takes on a whole new cheery vibe. The changes here are far more impactful than the water simply changing colors in the swamp. It's a radical transformation. This is one case where rewinding time really hurts. The Goron just don't feel like themselves in the winter, so the undoing of our work really stings. Speaking of, unless you are some professional speedrunner, a major upgrade is going to necessitate us resetting the land right away. With Big Goron indisposed, these two oddballs serve as the game's swordsmiths, and upgrading the sword takes time we don't have. One Song of Time and Goat rematch later, and we can revisit with our full 3 days intact. It's a good thing this boss fight is so fun. Mr. Moneybags Link can just cough up 100 rupees to reforge the Kokiri sword into the Razor Sword, doubling its damage. But this new blade is brittle. Gold dust is required to make the upgrade permanent. It follows that the Goron tribe might be able to help you gain this rare earth metal. After chatting it up with the tribe, one thing becomes apparent. With the winter finally over, these guys are ready to party. The path to the Goron racetrack can be opened with a powder keg, but this really is a poor fit for the Goron transformation. Awkwardly carrying the explosive across Snowhead by foot makes you feel weak and sloppy, instead of empowered. A Goron is meant to roll, right? And that's exactly what we do at the racetrack, one of the best minigames in the series as far as I'm concerned. By this point, I don't think I really need to explain how fun it is to blast around at Mach speed in this game. The race actually feels a lot like Mario Kart in track design, with magic containers strategically placed where you would find item boxes ordinarily. Claiming the gold dust prize proved a little challenge to a Choco Mountain veteran such as myself. Now all that's left for our gilded sword upgrade is waiting for the smiths to complete their work. And by waiting, I just mean playing the Song of Double Time. Bet you wouldn't expect an Argyle sword to look this sharp. Our next destination is Great Bay to the west. However, there is a minor roadblock preventing entry to the beach. Ocarina of Time players should remember how these small fences are cleared. Unlike in that game, Epona is a required element for progression, a smart change if you ask me, given how iconic the image of Link riding horseback is. At Romani Ranch, our old steed can be found with a young girl, also named Romani. I like to imagine that after being abandoned by Skull Kid, Epona followed Romani home due to her striking resemblance to the horse's previous owner, Malin. Something is up with Romani, who tasks you with helping to defend the ranch against mysterious invaders. They are never officially referred to as aliens, but it's an obvious inference to make when presented with otherworldly invaders stealing cows in the middle of the night. Majora's Mask isn't afraid to get a little weird, and I adore that about it. The horseback warm-up round against balloons is all it takes to relearn Epona's song, which Link somehow forgot. You could head to Great Bay now, but we can't just leave Romani to face them alone, can we? The invasion can be made trivially easy by playing the inverted Song of Time to halve the speed of the invaders' advance, and by ignoring Epona and just guarding the barn on foot. But shooting targets on horseback is too much fun to take the lazy route. After helping the younger sister on the first night, we are asked to also accompany Romani's older sister, Cremia, on her milk delivery route on the second night. I love this sequence, not for the shooting minigame defending against bandits, but for how personal the preceding conversation feels. Cremia really spills her soul to you, opening up about her worries about Romani, the pressures of managing the ranch since their father died, and her loneliness in the wake of her best friend Anju's engagement. It's quite mature storytelling for a children's N64 game, but as should be obvious by this point, Majora's Mask is anything but your typical game. Great Bay, finally! Termina's vacation getaway welcomes Link with a Zora dying on the beach right in front of him. Yeah, Majora's Mask isn't your typical game. This is Macau, who was beaten up by the nearby Gerudo pirates after heroically trying to recover his girlfriend's stolen eggs. They're both members of the famous Zora band, the Indigo Goes, which at least somewhat explains his energetic deathbed performance before his last breath. With Link the only witness to his fate, we're free to parade around the coastal town masked in his likeness. It's a bit sick, don't you think? Identity theft is not a joke, Link. Of the 4 main segments of the game, Great Bay is easily my favorite. The Great Bay Coast is such a unique location in Zelda, and I find the somber music punctuated by eerie seagull calls such a captivating contrast to the natural beauty of the region. Resolving the plight of the Zora, a beloved band broken up by the lead singer Lulu's tragedy at the hands of an evil band of pirates, is a standout segment in the game, much more interesting than the overused trope of freezing temperatures, not to pick on the Goron. I love those goofy guys nevertheless. These Zora have a far richer culture than the Goron or the Deku, or even the Zora tribe from Ocarina of Time. And that doesn't even account for how awesome the Zora transformation is. In Zora form, Link is about the size of his adult incarnation from Ocarina, and can fight with skillful martial arts as well as a boomerang-like shell attack. It isn't until you wade into the nearby water that the true prowess of the Zora form becomes clear. After slowly doggy paddling through water in Hylian form, awkwardly skipping over it in Deku form, and outright dying to it in Goron form, it's so liberating to launch yourself off like a jet in Zora form. I've never seen a game with swimming mechanics like this before. Pulling off tricks like dolphin jumping onto a floating platform feels amazing once mastered. Even more so than the Goron's rolling, swimming as a Zora has a steep learning curve. In more enclosed areas, it's very easy to bump into walls, but the option is always available to simply walk on the ocean bed, Iron Boot style. Pesky underwater enemies are no match for your electric field area of effect ability. Without the Zora mask, the vast Great Bay would be a complete chore to traverse, but with the Zora transformation, it's like a playground. Infiltrating the pirate fortress is the first order of business. This mini-dungeon could be compared to the Gerudo fortress from Ocarina, but is much bigger and more varied. Yes, it still maintains the same stealth elements, but they are much better implemented this time around. The stealth zones are more open, with plenty of cover. The added visibility removes reliance on trial and error, and allows you room to shoot down guards and plan a route. Along with the Zora eggs, the hookshot is also hidden within the walls of the fortress. It's unchanged from Ocarina, but there's no need to fix what wasn't broken. It's still an amazing tool for navigation and puzzles within a 3D space. The one fatal flaw with the pirate's fortress lies in the fact that there are 4 Zora eggs to find, and each requires a bottle for transport. It's unlikely a player will have 4 bottles by this point in the game, which feels like intentional padding. It is technically possible to have those 4 bottles, as well as the stone mask, which renders Link undetectable to enemies, but this would require some sequence breaking in Ikana Canyon. The case of the stone mask is really cool design. If players are following the main progression, they will experience the fortress stealth segment as intended, but the game doesn't stop you from removing that challenge if you are resourceful enough to find the stone mask early. But the number of eggs within the fortress really should be tuned to the expected bottle count of the player. The game hasn't nudged you towards Ikana Canyon at all to this point, so it feels cruel to punish the player with multiple trips in and out of the fortress. Chatting up the seaside locals reveals the location of the remaining Zora eggs at Pinnacle Rock. A homesick seahorse in the fisherman's hut will guide you through the murky waters where you'll find the eggs in a sea snake guarded lair. Return to the Marine Research Lab where the eggs will hatch and teach you the new wave Bossa Nova. Side note, now that we have all the transformation masks, and thus all the musical instruments, the Zora guitar is obviously the best. Link looks so rad shredding out on the thing. There is a ton to see and do in the Zora Music Hall. None of it is required, but it would be a shame to skip over. You can meet all the band members and hear their renditions of some classic Zelda tunes, read Lulu and Macau's diary entries for backstory on their relationship, and even deal with Lulu's peeping Tom. It's a shocking amount of care to put into an optional area. Each of the rooms is so colorful and calming. This is a great place to just vibe. Once we're ready to move on, we can play our new song for Lulu outside. She lost her voice when her eggs were stolen, but with the help of her new children, Link's performance snaps her out of it. The sound of Lulu's voice awakens a giant sleeping sea turtle, who offers Link a ride to Great Bay Temple to vanquish the evil within. Don't question video game logic, I guess. This guy reminds me of Jabu Jabu, and unfortunately just acts as transport to and from the dungeon. If you're going to throw a massive omniscient sea turtle into the game, it's so wasteful to not do anything cool with it. The Great Bay Temple was my version of Ocarina of Time's infamous Water Temple. I remember getting hopelessly lost and frustrated in here as a kid. These days, however, I really appreciate its ingenious design, and whether through growing into a stronger puzzle solver, or simply having played it several times prior, the temple feels like a much more reasonable challenge that remains satisfying. The dungeon's central room is a whirlpool that forces Link to swim around counterclockwise, restricting access to half the surrounding rooms. In what rooms are available to you, you must follow a red pipe through the dungeon and open various valves to allow water flow. Eventually, you can use this pipe's flow to reverse the direction of the whirlpool and open up the other half of the dungeon. I cherish these clever dungeon designs that task you with transforming the dungeon as a whole. They reliably offer the best aha moments in gaming. You only need to reverse the current direction once, so it's less complicated than something like the Water Temple, but it works the player's brain in a similar manner. A strong understanding of the entire map and how the rooms connect to one another is required to solve a puzzle that spans the dungeon as a whole. This is a far more engaging experience than merely tackling a gauntlet of disconnected challenges. The dungeon item is the ice arrows, but like the Snowhead Temple, there is plenty of design space opened with the various Zora abilities, and the recently acquired hookshot. Even so, the ice arrows would be a pretty great addition on their own. They can be used to create platforms on the water, freeze pipes to manipulate the flow of water, and create blocks out of enemies. All great mechanics that are put to creative use within the side rooms of Great Bay. There are two mini-bosses within Great Bay. The one against Gecko and his water blobs leaves me with nothing to discuss. It's as bland as they come. However, I do really like the battle against Wart, the always fashionable giant eyeball enemy. It brings to mind Argus from Link to the Past, where you have to separate all of the bubbles from his body before attacking him directly. There is no set method for doing so the fight is really open-ended. You can use your bow, bombs, hookshot, or just run in and start slashing. He gains much more aggression in the second phase, which completely changes the tempo of the fight, from a methodical dismemberment to a chaotic affair. War isn't much to look at, but offers a really fun fight. Good thing, because the actual boss of the Great Bay Temple couldn't be more boring. Like Morpha, Georg circles Link from the water as he tries to line up a shot from a dry platform. Unlike Morpha, Georg is nothing more than a big, ugly fish. The fight is literally no more involved than shooting the fish with an arrow, jumping in and doing a bit of damage with Zora form, climbing out of the water before he retaliates, and repeating. If your fight is going to be that one-dimensional, it better feature a really cool creature design. Georg massively disappoints in all areas. The fight is a terrible end to an otherwise excellent dungeon. Ikana Canyon is the final region left to tackle. Fun fact, even though the game attempts to block access until you acquire the ice arrows in the Great Bay Temple, It is possible in multiple ways to bypass this item gate. Doesn't really matter because you still need Epona in the hookshot, but it's still kind of fun. Unlike the prior 3 quadrants of the map, there isn't a centralized society living here, rather a multitude of different factions. Stall Children, Gyros, Gibdos, and Ghosts, oh my. There's a lot of hidden lore to gradually uncover about the history of this region and the war that took place long ago. These spirits were left to listlessly wander the canyon in wait for someone to put their souls to rest. Enter Heroic Link. There are a number of small tasks that must be completed here, but they don't exactly connect together in a nice coherent progression, so I'm only going to mention the more interesting elements. I really enjoy the encounter with the hulking Skullkida, the commander of the Ikana army. After giving chase to him and eventually catching up, he considers Link skillful enough to take command of his army, allowing him to rest in peace. With the Captain's Hat Mask, the Stall Children enemy type is recontextualized as an intelligent race of their own. Maybe not the most organized one, but it's really cool to get to hear from their perspective for once. The Gyro mask is a bit similar, but the ambushing Gyros still act like enemies to Link. You can gain helpful hints after dueling with them, however. Another memorable segment lies within the Music Box house. Inside lives a father and daughter, who reside in this desolate land to study the Gibdo mummies that inhabit it. However, only the daughter can be seen coming and going. If you sneak into their house, you'll be shocked to find the father's fascination with the Gibdos somehow led to him transforming into one himself. The thought of a young girl fending for herself alone in a lifeless wasteland, with only a monster locked in her closet for company, but refusing to leave out of a hope that that monster, her father, could be cured, is just heartbreaking. His studies uncovered a secret treasure guarded by the Gibdos under the well, which segues into an absolutely awful segment. The well is nothing more than a series of Gibdo who won't let you pass without bringing them something they desire. Most of what they desire can't be found in the well itself, and is some of the most inconvenient stuff you can imagine. Magic beans, Deku nuts, fish, milk, potions, etc. Even if you were given a full checklist of what you'd need up front, this would still be really poor design that serves only to waste the player's time. In actuality, it's even worse. You receive scavenger hunt hints one at a time, requiring you to constantly leave and return. It's wild to think that the same team that constructed the ingenious puzzle box dungeons of Majora's Mask also gave this a stamp of approval for main progression in the same game. Our reward for this grueling task is the Mirror Shield. The shield is very quickly rendered obsolete by the light arrows in the upcoming dungeon, but it's still a great inclusion due to its integration directly into Link's existing moveset. I also have to applaud the designer's unwavering commitment to the game's dark and unnerving atmosphere, because the shield looks a little bit different from the one we found in Ocarina of Time. Almost every item, enemy, and NPC model from Ocarina of Time is virtually unchanged in Majora's Mask, so when something simple like the Mirror Shield is given a facelift, I immediately wonder what the intent was. For the remainder of the game, the player is forced to stare at this horrifying expression constantly plastered literally in the exact center of the screen. I doubt it's possible, but if the player was somehow able to overlook the disturbing, ambiguously pained face of the moon overhead, the same cannot be said about the Mirror Shield. It's impossible to ignore and wildly unsettling, which surely was the intent, so I can't help but applaud the Mirror Shield for this unusual reason. Ikana Castle is a solid, if really short, mini-dungeon. Along with the Pirate Fortress, these mini-dungeons do slightly help offset the game's tiny dungeon count, but they don't come close to the scale or creativity of the main temples. Still, there are some unique challenges here, and the design of the castle is distinct from other areas in the game. I would complain about the powder keg being randomly required, when the game knows full well that no player is naturally going to have one on hand, but after the grueling Gibdo gauntlet, I've grown numb to stuff like this. The strongest element is absolutely the boss fight against the king and his guards. The build up to the fight, with the blinds closing, is excellent, and the Mirror Shield is put to good use reflecting the sun's rays to destroy the skeletons before they can revive. After the guards are taken out, the king is fought in a similar manner, but his extra size and strength, as well as some tricky new attacks, make for a good challenge. The callback to Twin Rover's bickering is the icing on top of a surprisingly good fight for a mini-dungeon. We learn the Elegy of Emptiness, which will be put to use shortly. The challenge of the Stone Tower Temple begins before you even enter the temple itself. The climb up to the doors is a puzzle all its own. In order to ascend, specific switches must be held down in specific orders, which is where the Elegy of Emptiness comes in. This Ocarina song allows Link to be in multiple places at once, perhaps a seed of inspiration for Four Swords. It can be used to create these disturbing dolls, one for each form Link can take. The idea is cool, but the execution repeats the sins of the Iron Boots. It's such an ordeal to use the transformation mask, play the elegy, watch the cutscene of yourself playing the elegy, and then watch the doll form on screen. Really kills the pacing of gameplay and takes you out of the experience for far too long. Majora's Mask saved the best for last. Stone Tower Temple is my favorite dungeon in the game. I've already mentioned how much I love dungeon designs that challenge you with manipulating the very layout of the dungeon to solve large-scale puzzles to progress. With the exception of the intro dungeon in Woodfall, every Majora's Mask dungeon follows this philosophy, but none more so than Stone Tower Temple. As you make your way through its different rooms tackling small-scale puzzles, it's hard to ignore how strange the architecture of the dungeon is. Once the dungeon's inner secret is revealed, the reason for this is sure to elicit childlike glee, if my experience is representative. By shooting these red switches with the light arrows, the entire dungeon is flipped upside down, Symphony of the Night style. Suddenly the floor is the ceiling, and the ceiling is the floor, and you have to completely relearn navigation routes. It's so unbelievably awesome and creative. The smaller scale puzzles housed within the dungeon utilize the entirety of Link's arsenal, including all of the transformation masks, which is exciting enough on its own, but in the face of such a cool dungeon-wide mechanic, it's difficult to discuss anything else. The way navigation is flipped on its head is all around amazing, but if I had to pick one specific moment where the gimmick is put to great use, I'd direct you to the very first room of the temple. After making your way through the entire dungeon in its normal and flipped state, you'll eventually return to this entry room and can hit a switch that was previously hidden on the ceiling. This switch causes a treasure chest to spawn that can be used as a hookshot target to reach the underside of the intro room where the boss door was hiding in plain sight the entire time. All I can say is wow. There are cool unique enemies here too, including these intimidating Igor Cyclops and the vampirish Gomes mini-boss. With all that Majora recycles from Ocarina, I don't think it gets quite enough credit for the number of new enemy types it adds onto the existing roster. Without actually counting, I'd estimate that it doubles the already healthy count, and you can definitely feel the difference. The final boss of the Stone Tower Temple is Twin Mold, a pair of gigantic worms that burrow and fly around the arena. The intended means of attack is with the bespoke Giant Mask, which brings Link up to their monstrous scale. This is a spectacle fight above all else, and I have no qualms with that. There is a place for tough combat bosses, tricky puzzle bosses, and bosses that just offer a uniquely fun thrill. There isn't much nuance to the fight, just wail on them kaiju style. It is possible to eschew the Giant Mask in this fight and lean on your trusty sword and bow, but it's a really annoying process. I am glad it's doable, but I don't actually enjoy the act of doing it. With that, we've freed all 4 giants and are free to bring the fight back to Skull Kid at the Clock Tower. If I have one complaint about Majora's Mask, it has to be the game's paltry dungeon count. For context, Ocarina of Time featured a whopping 8 dungeons, double Majora's number. To be fair, Majora's Mask's dungeons are of a very high quality overall, yet it's hard to not be left disappointed and wanting for more if you simply mainline the quest. Those who seek a richer experience in Majora's Mask will discover that the game's side content is often even more rewarding than the main content. Now, I'm not talking about the various minigames, like the many racing or sharpshooting challenges, or even the revamped Skulltula houses that smartly isolate the collectathon to a more curated challenge. These are often very enjoyable diversions from the heavier content, but I'm talking about the very heart of Majora's Mask, its characters. There are so many endearing characters in the world, each independently going about their own lives while Link's quest takes place. Every small glimpse into these lives, no matter how mundane, never ceases to be a treat. If a player requires more extrinsic motivation, the mask system incentivizes getting to know each NPC with the Zelda staple heart pieces. Some masks, like the Bunny Hood, which increases Link's movement speed, are closer to the transformation masks in that they offer a niche utility throughout the entire quest. But most masks are extremely situational, only intended for one specific interaction. It's a fun challenge to match up characters with masks. For example, the all-night mask seems utterly useless. That is until you try listening to Anju's grandmother's bedtime story. Whether your motivation is extrinsic or intrinsic, it would be a disservice to ignore this element of the game. Truly engaging with the citizens of Clocktown enhances the experience tremendously. Speaking of engagement, look no further than the separated couple of Anju and Cafe if you want to discover the depths of Majora's storytelling, and experience the most elaborate side quest I've ever seen. Anju, the town innkeeper, is worried about her fiancé Cafe, who has gone missing. Once you put together some clues and find Cafe, he explains that he was cursed by Skull Kid to take the form of a child, and had his ceremonial wedding mask stolen. He's ashamed of the whole debacle, and hides from Anju until he is ready to take her hand in marriage. In order to reunite the two, Link must work through the entire 3-day cycle, always being in the right place at the right time to push the two closer together. Going through this questline exposes hidden truths about the entire population of Clocktown, not just Anju and Cafe. The town is split apart by the decision to evacuate or stick to tradition and hold the festival, with the mayor caught in the middle. Gorman is distraught at the cancellation of his carnival performance and drinks his sorrows away at the milk bar. Sakan has a secret stash of stolen goods in Ikana Valley and peddles his wares each night at the Curiosity Shop. The Curiosity Shop owner was childhood friends with Cafe and lives in a secret hideout where he can keep an eye on the store. The postman goes through a nervous breakdown at the thought of abandoning his schedule, and therefore his identity, to evacuate. The actual tasks you perform aren't the important part. It's all the added character the quest offers to Clocktown and those who call it home. Yes, the quest is a bit overly complicated and obtuse without the assistance of a guide, but to nitpick over that would be missing the point entirely. When the two lovers are finally reunited thanks to your actions, none of those quibbles matter at all. While others are cowering in panic, these two are experiencing the happiest moment of their lives. Then, after a couple notes on the Ocarina, all that progress is undone, and the world is once again as broken as it was when Link first found it. The oppressive hopelessness of the impending moon crash has defined the entire experience to this point. No matter how much good Link does, it's only temporary until the cycle begins again. Even if you rescue the Deku Princess and clear the monkey's name, after the Song of Time is played, she is imprisoned again and the innocent monkey faces execution. Even if you end the Eternal Winter, before you know it, the Gorons go back to freezing to death. Even if you pull Lulu out of her depression, the celebration doesn't last long before the band is broken once again. Even if you bring peace to Ikana Canyon, the spirit's painful existence reverts right back to square one. The impermanence of the player's actions is something fundamentally unique to Majora's Mask that will inevitably affect the player's psyche. No matter what you do, not only is it impossible to save everyone, it's impossible to truly save anyone for anything more than a fleeting moment. The moon hangs overhead, constantly in view, taunting you and everyone who calls Termina home. Every time the player saves the game, they are abandoning all of Termina, leaving countless beloved characters to die a horrible death. Failure is unavoidable. That is, until we end the cycle of sorrow once and for all. When you return to the clock tower, the sense of deja vu from the opening of the game is broken upon calling forth the giants to hold the moon back. The dark spirit of Majora discards Skull Kid now that he can no longer serve the mask's evil purpose. Seeing the spirit actually speak for itself is chilling. This is surely a case where the voice I'm imagining is far more effective than whatever could be accomplished through in-game voice acting. It shouldn't be a shocking revelation that it wasn't Skull Kid using the mask, but the mask using Skull Kid as a pawn for its own destructive goals. The mask disappears to the moon, where the force of its impact multiplies beyond the giant's capacity to hold it back. Link fearlessly follows the mask through the portal. Whatever I was imagining on the other end of the portal, it wasn't this. We open our eyes to a verdant, picturesque field. It would be so easy to forget our troubles and just spend eternity here. The only other inhabitants are masked children. 4 are at play, marked by the masks of the 4 bosses Link has faced. If you do play with them and complete challenges themed around each respective dungeon, they will then ask you probing questions that cut to the heart. Do your friends think of you as a friend? What makes you happy, and does it make others happy? If you do the right thing, Does it make others happy? What is your true face? There's so much material to unpack here, and yet it completely defies explanation. I'm actually really glad there isn't a clear-cut answer for the meaning behind all of this. It's incredibly effective as a mystery. Why do the children look like the Happy Mask salesman, for one? Why do they want all your masks? I couldn't even begin to explain. Once you've played with the 4 children, all that's left is the 5th child. While the other children frolicked around the tree, this child sits ignored and alone in the fetal position until Link approaches. His figure dominated by the horrifying Majora's Mask, he asks if you want to play good guy against bad guy, with Link playing the part of the bad guy. What a way to introduce your climactic final boss fight. The fight against Majora is a 3-phase trial and is just as weird as you'd expect. First you face off with the mask itself, which floats around the arena accompanied by the remains of the 4 main bosses. The trippy imagery here is nightmarish and extremely memorable, even when the fight is pretty simple at its core. The second phase, Majora's Incarnation, sees the mask sprout arms and legs. It's admittedly a goofy image out of context, but I imagine this is Majora mocking Link. It's playing with Link and spends most of its time dancing around the arena, dodging Link's attacks rather than fighting back. The final form, Majora's Wrath, towers over Link and keeps up a relentless offense with a pair of whips. I don't know if this is meant to be Majora's true form, but if it is, it works for me. It no longer merely looks like the mask grew limbs, but appears as an eldritch being that still resembles its iconic mask while striking fear into your heart. I'll admit it's not as satisfying to defeat as something like Ganon, but I can't imagine how you could turn a mask into a satisfying boss fight any more effectively. As long as you are adequately prepared, none of these phases should present an overwhelming challenge. But if you won't be content until you absolutely obliterate Majora, that's where the fierce deity mask comes in. If you've collected each and every mask along your journey and hand them all into the Moon Children, you'll be rewarded with this enigmatic mask, which unleashes an awful and mighty power when donned. Is this a power for good or for evil? Yet another impenetrable mystery the game leaves you to sit with. Regardless, it's more than a match for Majora. With Majora defeated, everything begins to fall back into its rightful place. Getting to finally meet the true Skull Kid, a lonely youngster who just wanted a friend, is really heartwarming. The Happy Mask salesman reminds Link that this isn't his world, prompting the game's bittersweet goodbye. As I've reiterated time and time again, the characters of Termina are the heart of this game, and it's painful to leave them now that they've finally been saved. As the credits roll, I'm glad we at least get hints as to what their future holds, now that they've been broken free of the time loop. The game ends on a picture depicting Skull Kid and his new friend Link, along with the giants, carved with love. I could go on and on about how innovative the 3-day cycle is, how impactful the characterization of the NPCs is, how cleverly the dungeons are designed, or how fun the transformation masks are to control. In fact, I've done all of those things over the last hour or so, and I hope you've come to appreciate all of those elements. But when I try and really put a finger on what makes Majora's Mask so special, it's none of those things. It's something I just can't quite put into words. The experience of actually playing the game is more than just listening to someone explain various mechanics, or even watching someone else play. The best word I've heard bandied about in describing Majora's Mask's unique feel is atmosphere. The game is positively dripping with it. But even that word doesn't fully encapsulate the effect the game has on me, one unlike any I've experienced before or since. An artist will always leave a bit of themselves in their art, so it shouldn't be surprising that a development fraught with insurmountable obstacles and harsh deadlines would lead to a disheartened tale of impending doom and inevitable failure. It's why Majora's Mask remains so special. You can't just replicate that on a whim. I'm sure many of you are waiting for me to proclaim Ocarina or Majora as the superior game, but it's impossible to label one the winner. Majora's Mask development team was faced with the impossible task of creating a worthy sequel to Ocarina of Time, the most acclaimed game of all time. They succeeded, not in surpassing Ocarina of Time, but in going in a completely untrodden direction. In my eyes, this was the perfect outcome. Instead of one game being relegated to an inferior iteration of the other, both games were able to establish their own enduring legacy. That being said, I will admit that I do personally prefer Majora. Everything that went into its creation was a once-in-a-lifetime combination of factors, and miraculously, what by all odds should have been a disaster, resulted in a masterpiece. There is nothing else like Majora's Mask, not within the Zelda series, not within the video game industry, and not within the artistic world as a whole. It is truly one of a kind. Thanks for accompanying me on this journey. I hope my humble video was able to provide some insight and entertainment on a personal favorite of mine. Please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and reactions in the comments. I love to hear from viewers and get a different perspective. Majora's Mask's experimental nature and ambiguous storytelling practically demand discussion. If you do wish to offer further support, I have set up a Patreon page which functions as a simple tip jar. Down the road I may explore different options for better utilizing it, but right now please only contribute if you wish to go above and beyond in supporting my endeavors here, like Axel Deeker did. Regardless, just the simple act of you watching this video is more than enough reward for the work I put into its creation. Thank you so much, and until next time, take care.